During the height of the COVID-19 pandemic in April 2020, my colleague Blanca Piguin and I had a conversation with Peter Elbow over Zoom, where we discussed voice, theory, the body, and collage. That interview served as the base for my thesis and subsequent research on Elbow's most recent perspectives on voice in writing, especially as it connects to the body and collage as vessels for voice to crystallize and grow. Elbow was especially animated, even in his mid-80s, and eager to talk about voice again due to its re-emergence in modern scholarship. He spoke again and again about the somewhat sudden criticism that occurred towards studying voice within the field of rhetoric and composition. In speaking about voice through expressivism as a widely accepted pedagogical approach to writing instruction during its peak, Elbow notes,
for a while, it was so popular, like everybody was in it, and it was just a lot of enthusiasm. And then it went to the opposite, totally forbidden.
In this talk, we aim to expand Elbow's decade-long work with voice and span embodiments of Gregory Ulmer's Electrate voice within multimodal composition spaces. In electracy, voice is neither active nor passive, but somewhere in the middle, a reflexive receptacle. Just as our bodies have reflexes to certain touch, sounds, taste, sights, and scents, voice reflexively responds to its intertextual and cultural surroundings. We hope to conjure up and remake the contentious journey of voice in rhetoric and composition. Most notably and famously tied to Elbow and other expressivists from the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, voice was once one of the most debated topics in the field. The question isn't whether or not voice exists, as it seems clear most scholars in the field acknowledge that it does. What people are wondering is if voice can still be relevant to modern theories and composition pedagogies. It can seem so outdated when we remember that voice first boomed back in the 70s and 80s. Back then, in the mid to late 20th century, according to Kathleen Blake Yancey in the collection Voices on Voice, Perspectives, Definitions, Inquiry, voice provided a convenient conceptual understanding for both the writer and the act of writing. Like all metaphors, it moves from what we know, often intuitively, to what we seek to describe. While many educators may still reference voice when speaking to their students about writing, they may be doing so without enough intentional meaning or connection between this metaphor and any singular or networked part of students' writing processes or identities as writers. Yancey emphasizes the power of acknowledging voice intentionally. Voice seems to bring to writing and the text a quality we don't have otherwise. The individual human being composed of words in the text. Without intention and consideration of all the networks the voice metaphor reaches within a contemporary writing classroom for the contemporary writer, the term voice continues as a fuzzy or ambiguous term loftily cited within writing classrooms, but with no clear meaning or purpose for many educators.
Elbow's work on voice within the classroom has experienced a variety of responses from the field: praise, neutrality, discrediting, etc. However, in our contemporary classroom of the 2020s, experiencing emerging discourses and rhetorics of participatory culture, social media, affect, and the COVID-19 health crisis and pandemic, Elbow's work on voice is increasingly more relevant than ever before due to its intersectional ideas and praxis with other emerging and still maturing popular theoretical perspectives within the field, such as language inclusivity and electracy. After completing my work with voice and electricity, I am more convinced than ever that his work has significant connections to the many subdisciplines within rhetoric and composition.
Why did it go so out of fashion? I mean, it can be a topic of kind of cultural history. How come it got to be so taboo? There was a period where that condemnation was very, very strong. I think it's sort of past now. I mean, I don't think people are so vehement about. I mean, it used to be just to say the word voice was to get you in trouble. If you were doing what you're doing now, back then, the 90s, 80s and 90s, you'd have a hard time getting a faculty member to sponsor you or. But anyway, that has sort of passed.
Elbow seemed hesitant for upcoming graduate students to take a stance on the topic of voice, hinting at positioning oneself as a researcher of voice, but not positioning for or against. Elbow maintained that Berlin was the strongest negative voice, and Berlin positioned voice as a discussion of theory. But why was voice discredited, and did it happen quickly? Elbow remembered that the shift away from voice felt relatively sudden.
Well, relatively sudden, not overnight, but seemed like so many people were interested in it, and for the reasons I was, it just felt like an obviously important thing, and then all of a sudden it became problematic. Berlin, his first name, he was in a way the strongest negative voice, trying to show how he all of a sudden upped the ante to a very theoretical. I mean, sort of, we were writing about voice and people. He made it. He made it a kind of ideological critique, and he upped it to a matter of theory. I sort of felt like I was writing about people and people writing and their writing that they produced. And then I forget how to say this right, but he sort of said, "Well, this is a matter of theory." He said, "Let's not talk about real people. Let's talk and their actual writing. Let's talk about theory." And all of a sudden, what's interesting, I think, is why how quickly his essay about that took root and it became cast in concrete. And there not many people questioned it. It's just he made this critique. It's a sensible critique. I mean, it's absolutely, why not say the things he said? But all of a sudden, it acted as a kind of taboo on the ways in which I tended to write about voice.
During the interview, we repeatedly came back to the realization that voice as theory is rooted in privilege.
When people want to shift the issue to a theoretical level, I would say in too much of a hurry, all of a sudden they're using a very privileged language. They're using a language that's, that's hard to understand. Yeah. And it feels like a kind of a non-human language.
This shift to the non-human works in the space of theory, but moving voice into electricity evolves the discussion into an embodied notion of voice, a human language.
We're not advocating bringing voice back into its pre-theory iteration, but to rethink and remake it, humanizing voice and shifting the perspective on the concept. To support this remaking, Elbow does say that voice is kinesthetic. It's not always literal, and it includes felt experiences. Felt voice encompasses everything, everywhere, all at once, including spatiality, memory, thought, intuition, sensory, affect, kairotic moments, and so on.
I have been describing electric voice so far as a very felt, embodied phenomenon, which can very much be the case. But voice can be everything, and always has been, so to speak. A metaphor for this I came up with is the everything bagel. In my mind, it is an interesting lens or metaphor to consider for electric voice in thinking of it as an autonomous voice body that is often embodied and felt deeply within ourselves, while also being made up of so many things outside ourselves all at once.
In Camera Lucida, Roland Barthes describes the punctum of recognition as an interruption to an image's studium or intended meaning. It is the element which rises from the scene, shoots out of it like an arrow, and pierces the viewer. The punctum of recognition is this jolting feeling when the viewer suddenly feels an intimate and powerful connection to the image or media and triggers a sort of time jump to other instances where the same feelings were present. The associative connections made during these moments of time jumping make up the felt sense of electrate voice. The power of intimacy and connection between the self and media is a way that voice moves beyond the isolated self into the everything bagel. It is thrown out into the public through the experience of the punctum of recognition.
The body processes meaning through punctums, intuition, emotional associations, memory, and sensory experience randomly and without hesitation, which the mind then can also process and make further sense of. The body, as an extension of the mind, offers a more visceral and vivid window of what this meaning making becomes everything, everywhere, all at once. So, how can we teach students to access this remaking of voice, this electric voice?
In my decades-long experience working with the punctum of recognition, I have seen that students understand the idea of punctum almost immediately. They can recall moments when something has triggered such a visceral reaction in them that they were jolted into action. While the punctum of recognition cannot be willed into existence, it can emerge when we are in tune with an affective mindset, paying attention to bodily responses and not dismissing them as irrational or unnecessarily emotional.
Even more specifically, we could have a discussion about cringe culture, since cringe is wholly affective. It is most often felt in the body first before words become available to describe the feeling. There are a few ways we can help students to access this affective mindset. Students could watch a variety of cringy videos, reels, etc., and create video responses with the aim of showing cringe in action. Students could also recall an instance or instances where they experienced a punctum of recognition and follow the felt connections that arose from it.
Through these methods and practices, we advocate making spatiality a conscious part of the learning experience. Students are aware of their spatiality in the moment of feeling the punctum of recognition and should investigate the role that those particular spaces play. As Sarah and Jesse have explored in previous research, for them, it is sitting in a car listening to a particular genre of music.
At the end of our interview, Elbow offered some words of support for my investigation into and remaking of Electrate Voice.
Thank you so much.
That's great. Give it hell.